In this session, we are going to look at netting as an important role in credit risk management. So, going with a broader agenda, we are talking about how the counterparty risk typically originated, right? The origins of the counterparty risk. What do I mean by ISDA master agreement? And within that, talking more in terms of netting as an aspect. So, what are the different types of nettings? Where we are going to talk about the payment netting as well as the closeout netting. How do I differentiate between these two worlds of nettings? What kind of impact does netting create, right, on the overall value of the portfolio? And why do I really need netting? And then explaining the netting processes in detail. What do I mean by netting sets? And we are finally just talking about the product coverage with respect to netting. So these are the various aspects that we will look at, right? So let's get started. See, typically, whenever I talk about a traditional counterparty risk, right? So the simplest of the examples, let's say an institution A, it has got into some kind of a trade, some kind of a contract with an institution B. But the same equal and opposite kind of a transaction it has got in with an institution C, right? So logically speaking, this this particular contract is equal and opposite to this particular contract, right? So it means it could be a perfect hedge, right? Let me assume that it's a perfect hedge. Now in this situation, this particular organization, it does not have any kind of volatility to the overall profit and loss. So if it has gained from this particular trade, it will lose from this particular trade and vice versa. So the volatility of the overall profitability does not exist, which means in this kind of a situation, there is no scope for any kind of a market risk. So market risk is closely or is almost eliminated in this particular transaction. But there is a possibility that if this party defaults, right? If this particular party defaults, then this would leave the exposure to the other side of the trade. Now this is where A will be suffering with respect to C. If B has defaulted, A is suffering with respect to C, because when will B default? If B is at a loss and A is at a gain, that is when B is going to default typically. Now if A is at a gain here, in this contract A will be at a loss, so A has to pay C, but he has not received from B. Now this is where either of the parties can default, right? Probably B or C. If they default, then A is exposed uh, to the risk of settlement to the other party. Now this is what is a classic example of counterparty risk, right? Now how do I really address all this? So we talk about ISDA master agreement. a kind of a legal agreement. ISDA, International Swaps and Derivatives Association. Now this is a kind of an organization for OTC derivatives, right? International Swaps and Derivatives Association for OTC derivatives. They have come out with a kind of master agreement framework, which is purely targeted towards bilateral. So when two companies are entering into an OTC derivatives contract, they can use the ISDA master agreement. So it contains purely the terms and conditions which governs the transactions between the two parties. Primarily, any kind of legal uncertainties that are going to catch up because of the trades between the two parties, that would be covered, and the major objective is try to address the counterparty risk, try to clarify things in the document in such a way that the counterparty risk gets almost mitigated. So along with the general terms of the contract between both the parties, there is a very lot of focus on aspects like netting, right? What is the procedure for netting the transactions? It talks about the collateral and what do I mean by default? What are the events that trigger the default? And any other termination kind of stuff of the agreement between both the parties. They are all defined very clearly as a part of the ISDA master agreement. So from a company's standpoint, of multiple transactions, right? Probably there need not be a separate ISDA for each transaction. Multiple transactions can be a part of one single ISDA, right? It could be a single legal contract containing multiple transactions, and even the term of the contract could be indefinite, right? And I can simply keep adding the transactions to this one single master itself. So individual transactions I am simply adding by or incorporating by the reference into that ISDA, and so which means I really don't need to update or change any aspect of the ISDA agreement, and the trading keeps occurring. So one single ISDA between the parties covering multiple transactions that are occurring between them. So that's how the ISDA master agreement is trying to reduce the counterparty risk by trying to address lot of critical aspects of the OTC derivatives bilateral agreement. Now, we have to keep understanding all these various dimensions. Now, that is where I want to get started with the world of netting. One of the important aspects, because if you start looking at, before I get into the netting as a part of the derivatives, let's try a simple example, right? A and B. B has issued a debt security, issued a bond, and A has purchased that bond, right? Okay, so what is the kind of a transaction? B is liable to pay interest and the principal to A as and when they fall due. Now let's say B has gone bankrupt, right? Now what will happen to A here? A can expect a big loss because B has defaulted, and whatever there is a recovery, Okay, we can say that something can be recovered from B by selling some of the assets of B. But again, there is a time before which any recovery can occur. Right? And this is purely linked to the notional amount of the claim. And along with probably the seniority that is associated with that particular claim. Though I may not be very clear on when I would be getting this money back. Though he may not be clear on when and how much he is going to get back. Some level of prediction is very much possible on those lines. Right? Some level of prediction, because by knowing the notional amount and the seniority, some level of prediction can very well be made. So, which means if I am talking about a default with respect to a corporate bond, what we are simply saying is how much has to be recovered and when it would be recovered is not a big serious problem. Though it is problematic, it's not considered a serious problem because there is something that I can predict in this process. But coming to the world of derivatives, which are much fast moving, participants are regularly changing their positions, and there is a lot of hedging activity that is happening by different participants against each other. So when a counterparty is defaulting here, the market really needs to have a mechanism. When a counterparty is defaulting, the market really needs to have a mechanism where it can re-hedge. I should be able to re-hedge the position with other counterparties. Right? If one is defaulting, I should have a mechanism where I can do a re-hedge of my transactions with the other counterparties. And at the same time, within, let's say between A and B, whatever one has with respect to the other, whatever the transactions that are happening between A and B, whatever A owes to B and whatever B owes to A in different transactions that are existing between both of them, there should be some level of offsetting between these two types of transactions. Now that is where we are talking about the netting. Now in this netting, there are two major terms, one being the payment netting, where the cash flows, whichever are occurring on the same day, they are netted, they are offsetted. So this is more and more related to settlement risk. So I am netting the cash flows that have to be received versus to be paid on one single day, and only the net is either paid or received. So it is more and more associated with the settlement risk. Whereas on the other side, I am talking about closeout netting. Closeout netting is a very interesting aspect because we are talking about termination. Termination of all the contracts between the defaulted counterparty and the solvent counterparty. We are terminating all the contracts along with offsetting. Right? We are terminating along with offsetting all the transaction values between the two parties. And this is more and more addressing the counterparty risk. So netting falls into two categories. One, which is a payment netting, which generally happens even with any kind of swap transactions. Whatever the payments that have to be made, they are netted off before the payment. Whereas in closeout netting, we are talking about the termination of all the contracts between the two parties, offsetting all the transaction values, and which is more and more associated with the counterparty risk. Now, this netting covering all the derivatives. It's today accepted in many of the countries. ISDA has the legal opinion supporting the closeout and the netting provisions in the master agreement. So there is a lot of enforceability across the various jurisdictions with respect to the netting process, right? So that's more or less legal. Now let's try to understand what we really mean by payment netting, right? Though we have defined it, saying the cash flows that are occurring on a single day, they are netted and the net is paid. So this is primarily applicable when any institution is either paying or receiving more than one cash flow in a day. During one single day, we are talking about paying or receiving more than one cash flow. So the payment netting is allowing an institution to combine whatever the cash flows that are either paid or received on one single day into a single net payment. So the settlement risk is reduced, operational efficiency comes into picture. Right? So the major advantage is operational efficiency and there is a drastic reduction in the settlement risk. But of course, it looks as if we are simply offsetting the positives with the negatives, and it looks like a very simple process which gives the maximum reduction of any risk. But of course, there is some level of operational risk. Right? The settlement risk might be eliminated to a large extent, but there is a possibility of an operational risk that can come up in the process. Because we are talking about the net amount to be paid or received. So how do I really compute that net amount? So there is a possibility of the operational risk to crop up in this process. But the more and more important aspect is the closeout netting. Though payment netting is very much possible, the closeout netting is a very interesting part because this is something to do with the counterparty risk in detail. Now again, there could be different trades that are existing between two counterparties. A and B might have got into multiple trades of multiple amounts on multiple occasions. So there could be many different trades with a single counterparty. And in some cases, some of the trades could be very simple, whereas some of them could be as complex as possible. And each trade could be on a different kind of a product, different kinds of an asset class, right? Now, in this, that out of the different kinds of trades that are possible, some trades could be simple hedges, right? If not a perfect hedge, at least a partial hedge. So the two trades generally move in opposite direction, right? Probably if they are hedges, so trade 1 versus trade 2, they move in opposite direction. So if the A is getting benefited in trade 1, it will be losing in trade 2 and vice versa. In some cases, the trades could be simply unwinds. Right? We are not cancelling a transaction, but we are simply creating a reverse of that particular transaction with the same counterparty. So again, equal and opposite values. So it is also increasing the size of the position. Right? So some trades could be a simple unwinds with the existing counterparty. Instead of cancelling, we are executing the reverse. So it's a direct consequence that the trade has already been cancelled. Now in some cases like this, we even perform a compression exercise, which I'll talk about slightly later. So where I can reduce the exposure of this kind of contracts. But if I don't do this compression, then probably these kind of trades will exist in the system for quite some time. And there could be a possibility that the trades are to a large extent independent. They are from different asset classes, different underlyings, so the correlations that could exist between them could be much, much lower. Now, so they could fall into any of these three kind of categories. They could be independent, they could be hedges which are perfectly moving in the opposite direction, or there could be unwinds of the existing contracts itself. But in reality, when we are talking about the loss with respect to a counterparty, we are simply saying if the counterparty is defaulting, the loss is simply the sum of exposure. You add up all the exposures to the counterparty and you simply say it as the sum of the exposure. So it may so happen that the trade 1 and trade 2 are simply hedges. I mean, trade 2 is hedge of trade 1. Now there could be a gain of 10 million here, but there will be a loss of 10 million because they are opposite to each other. But what the typical definition of the counterparty risk is coming up is the loss in this case is 10 million, even in this case is 10 million. So overall there is a 20 million possibility, right? Because if the counterparty here loses, it's a 10 million. If the counterparty here loses also, it's a 10 million. Or the better way to talk about, because it's negative, there is no chance of losing here, so it's 0 million. So the overall exposure is around 10 million, right? So these two are not netted here, but all the positive exposures are simply considered and added and says that this is the loss that can occur if the counterparty defaults. So what we are simply saying is if the counterparty is defaulting, the loss that is occurring due to the settlement of the trade. So I have to settle, let's say, okay, let me take an example. Let me take an example where there are two trades, right? So trade 1 and trade 2. One is a cancellation of the other. So let's assume here the value is 10 million and here it is minus 10 million or the vice versa. Now when I'm simply looking at these being opposite transactions, the overall net value of the trade is 0. But the total exposure, by a direct calculation, the total exposure is 10 million in both the scenario. If either if the default happens here or here, the total exposure is 10 million itself. So if the counterparty is defaulting, now for me there is a loss because I have to settle this part with my counterparty. In this case, I have to in trade 2, I have to pay 10 million to the counterparty. So one side is I have a loss because I have to settle the trade which is having a negative mark to market value, but I will not be able to claim on this particular trade which is having that positive mark to market value. That is the biggest disadvantage. Here my position is a negative 10 million which I have to pay to my counterparty, but where I have to receive 10 million, I can't claim because the counterparty has defaulted. This is where I get into a perverse situation, right? I have to pay, but I can't get back. Because logically, if you talk about any valuation system, right? Any system which is doing the computation here, it shows zero mark to market value, and any market risk system also will say that the market risk is zero. For this kind of two trades put together, it computes that the market risk is zero. But the counterparty risk is not anywhere close to zero. And when we are bringing in the bankruptcy part, where B has defaulted and it has gone into a bankruptcy, the proceedings are very long, they are unpredictable kind of stuff. And the counterparty losses are likely to be compounded because of the uncertainty as to when the termination actually occurs. But on the other side, when you look at a non-derivative transaction where we are simply talking about the debt that is issued by B held by A, not the derivatives, the traditional debt which is issued by B and it is invested by A, at least the exposure is known. How much he will be losing is known or predicted with a great level of certainty, even though the recovery, how much and at what time is not that certain, but there is a good level of predictability that exists into the mechanism, and there is a high level cap what could be the maximum amount that could be received. But in case of derivatives, there is a constant rebalancing that is happening to maintain the hedged positions. So, in case a counterparty is in default, the cash flows will simply cease and the institution really needs to execute new replacement contracts. Now, this is where the closeout netting really plays a very handy role. The need for closeout netting is very, very important from this particular dimension. So let's try to understand what happens as a part of the closeout netting process. So this generally comes into picture only when the counterparty is defaulted. It does not come before that. So what it simply talks about is a timely termination and settlement. In case a counterparty defaults, we are talking about a timely termination and settlement of the net value of all the trades with that particular counterparty. So here we are actually talking about two words, one being the closeout and two being netting. Two important words in this context. So closeout is the kind of a right that I can terminate the transaction with the defaulted counterparty and I can seize any kind of contractual payments. That is the kind of a right that I have with respect to closeout. Whereas when we talk about the netting, it's a right to typically offset the amounts whichever are due at the termination to determine a net balance. Right? Netting is actually determining the net balance. So it's a simple summation of the positive and the negative mark-to-market values, which will finally determine the final closeout amount. So the final closeout net could be again a positive or a negative. If it is negative, then I have to pay to my counterparty who has defaulted, and if it is positive, that is the net claim that I have from my counterparty. So, but the advantage that is coming with this closeout netting is it is resulting in an immediate termination of all the contracts between both the parties, and there is an offsetting of the amount it owes to the counterparty against what the counterparty owes to it. So there is a net computation that happens. Now let's say if the net is negative, which means the solvent counterparty owes to the defaulted counterparty, then the payment is made. Whereas if the net is positive, it means that the defaulted counterparty owes to the solvent counterparty, means there is a the counterparty has to pay, the defaulted counterparty should pay to the solvent one. Then the solvent counterparty could initiate a kind of bankruptcy claim for this amount. There could be a bankruptcy claim. So the surviving institution or the solvent institution can immediately realize the gains on the transaction against the losses on the other transactions. In this, what is the advantage? The company which is gaining, it can offset against the losses on the other transactions with the same counterparty, and it can initiate the bankruptcy process only for its net exposure. Only to the extent of its net exposure, it can very well initiate the bankruptcy process against the defaulted counterparty. And if there had not been any kind of netting like this, if there is a netting, that is the kind of an advantage. And if there is not any such kind of a netting, the market participants, they find themselves that they are locked. The solvent counterparty finds that it is locked into the contract that fluctuate in values and which are impossible to hedge. Because I can't get into an offsetting transaction with any other counterparty for this particular transaction, because the chances of recovery are much lesser, right? So that is where the closeout netting comes very handy. And we have talked about the if we are trying to compare payment netting, it has reduced my settlement risk because we have offsetted the cash flows against each other. Closeout netting is very much associated with the counterparty risk because there is a lot of reduction with respect to pre-settlement, right? Because I am cancelling out or terminating all kinds of contracts that are existing with this particular counterparty. So there is a lot of reduction of pre-settlement risk that is occurring here. So this entire thing is a legal agreement between the two parties, and this will become active when any of them is typically defaulting. So from this perspective, we can very clearly say that the netting agreements are very crucial to recognize the benefit of offsetting trades with the same party. So this is controlling the exposure to a counterparty, right? This is reducing the exposure to a counterparty if there are two or more transactions. Because without netting, if the counterparty is defaulting, the exposure is simply the sum of all the transactions where the mark-to-market value is positive. The sum of all the positive mark-to-market values is going to be the exposure with that particular counterparty. So I will not, if any particular transaction is having negative mark-to-market value, it would be considered as zero in the computation of the exposure. So there is no netting that is happening. So the derivatives, whichever are having negative mark-to-market value, I will have to settle them with my counterparty. I have to make payment to my counterparty. But whichever are the ones that are having a positive mark-to-market value, they represent a claim in the bankruptcy process. So even though we have a perfectly offsetting derivatives transaction, plus 10, minus 10 kind of transactions with the same counterparty, but still our exposure will not be zero. Our exposure will still be 10 because minus 10 will result in me settling with my counterparty, and plus 10 will result in filing a claim in the bankruptcy process and having to wait for receiving the same. So, just as an example, if I talk about, let's say, A and B, they have 5 transactions between them. And at a particular point in time, let's say their mark to market values are like plus 8 million on first trade, minus 3 million on the second trade, plus 6 million on the third, plus 1 million on the fourth, and let's say minus 5 million on the fifth. Right? Now, if I say with netting, what is the exposure? 8 plus 6, 14 plus 1, 15 minus 8. So the exposure is plus 7 if the netting is implemented. But if I am saying without netting, the negatives I simply ignore. I take them as zeros. And I say for the positives 8 plus 6, 14 plus 1, 15. So I say the exposure is 15 million. So the exposure is more than double without netting versus with netting. Right? So that's the kind of a difference the closeout netting is typically bringing into the picture. Right? Now, I have to discuss in this context another important term called SetOff. It is more or less similar to the closeout netting. And it is also talking about the obligations between the two parties where we are doing an offset, but this is resulting in creating a new obligation. A kind of new contract gets created, which purely represents the difference in the settled values between the two parties. It's a kind of a new contract. All of them are offset against each other and the net is created as a difference. So this is purely talking about the actual obligations. When we have talked about closeout netting, it's only to do with the calculated amount. Whereas here, in case of SetOff, we are talking of the actual obligations that are offsetted and a new contract is being created. But in many cases, we try to use both these terms interchangeably. All right. Okay. So the next aspect I want to talk about is the concept of netting sets, groups, and the kind of sub-additivity that exists within the groups and across the groups. How sub-additivity plays a role within the group and across the group. So whenever I talk about a netting set, it's a set of trades that can be legally netted together. Right? I can net them together in case a company has defaulted. So the set, whenever I am using the word set, it need not be 100 trades. It could be a single trade also. And with the counterparty, I can have multiple such kind of netting sets. It need not be one netting set per counterparty. There could be multiple netting sets with respect to one counterparty also. Now, so this is one set, this is one set, this is one set. Now what we are simply saying is, across the netting sets, the exposures are simply additive. Across the sets, the exposures are simply additive, whereas within the set, we are considering the mark-to-market values. So the positives are offsetted against the negatives and vice versa. Here across, the exposures are additive. Simply I add the exposures. Whereas, and we have defined the exposure as simply the sum of all the positive mark-to-market values. That is what is the exposure. So they are simply additive here. Whereas within the netting set, whatever are the transactions, I am simply adding the mark to market values, which means the positives could be there, negatives could be there. I am not making the negatives zero there. I am offsetting the positives against the negative. So that is what I mean. Across the netting sets, the exposure is always additive, whereas within the set, we are talking about the addition of the mark to market values where the positives and negatives can be offsetted against each other. So within a netting set, so if I'm talking about the exposure, I can't add the exposure directly. Or if I'm talking about credit value adjustment, CVA, which we'll try to determine slightly later, they are not simply additive. So to some extent, it is reducing the overall risk, right? But this is where the difficulty comes in. How do I quantify it? Because there is a lot of correlation and various dimensions that I have looked at internally. So how do I really quantify the exposure? How do I really quantify the CVA? That becomes more and more complex because it's not additive. So it is very much clear here that I can't analyze one single individual transaction on its own, but I have to look at it with respect to the entire netting set. So that brings a little bit of additional layer of complexity into the entire process. Now, what is the kind of impact does netting create? So one of the major aspects or one of the major drivers for the OTC derivatives market, the growth in the OTC derivatives market, there is no doubt netting has played a very important role. See, the overall credit exposure in the market, it is growing at a much lesser rate than the actual growth of the market. And along with this has also helped the various dealers because of the positives offsetting against the negatives. The various dealers, they are able to build a large book with a very small capital base. Right? So it has resulted in an expansion and a greater concentration of the derivatives market. And if you typically look at the exposures are reduced almost by 90% because of this closeout netting. Right? But yeah, on the downside, if I have to look at, netted positions are more and more volatile. Right? Because the fluctuation, the net amount is much smaller, but the fluctuations are much higher than their underlying gross positions. So, which means there is a very high possibility of a systemic risk bursting out because of very heavy netted transactions. Just like a leverage transactions that can cause heavy systemic risk, even the netted transactions can very well cause the systemic risk. So the other aspect which we have already discussed, if an institution is executing an offsetting position with another market participant, so it is able to reduce the market risk with this offsetting transaction. We see that the market risk is significantly reduced, but they will have the counterparty risk with respect to both the counterparties. The party with whom the original transaction got initiated, the party with whom the offsetting transaction got initiated. So when we are getting into the netting, we are talking about executing the reverse, but with the original counterparty. So if we have got into two transactions with the same counterparty and we have put in the netting, then market risk is eliminated and even the counterparty risk is also eliminated. So that is the kind of an impact that netting is creating in the process. So there is, so again, the misuse part. Okay, A and B. So initially there has been a trade between A and B, trade 1. Now A wants to get into a trade 2 with B, which is more like offsetting the trade 1. So that the net is a cancellation between the two. Now B really does not want to get into that offsetting, because B is in a profitable position, A is in a loss making position. So A wants to cancel off the contract, whereas B is not interested. Now this is where B will be thinking of trading out of the position. They can very well give unfavorable terms to A. They want to take an advantage. B really wants to take an advantage of A, because by getting into this transaction number 2, there is a market risk which is eliminated, there is a counterparty risk that is eliminated. But B really does not want to get into it, because B is in a very profitable position. Now what can B do? It can offer some kind of unfavorable terms to A and try to extract the maximum financial gain out of this particular transaction. So that could be one more place where the netting can be taken advantage of. So this unfavorable terms can be accepted or may not be accepted, but that is one possibility that can come with respect to the netting process. Now, if there are multiple positions with the same counterparty but different risk exposures, another scenario. So let's say there is both an interest rate hedge, A and B have got into an interest rate hedge, and let's say a forex hedge, foreign exchange hedge. But we know between these two, the correlation is much smaller, or probably unrelated kind of scenario, very close to zero. So when we are executing both these hedges with the same counterparty, overall counterparty risk is directly reduced. So in this case, there could be a lot more favorable terms, whereas in the earlier case, there could be a lot more unfavorable terms. So that's one side of netting that we need to look at. Now, looking at the other major implication of the netting, it changes the way the market participants react to the perceptions of the increasing risk of a counterparty. Right? Let's say a risk with a particular counterparty is increasing. Now, if there was no netting, let's assume that this particular counterparty has trades with many other companies. Now, all these companies which are trading with this particular counterparty, for them, they have a very strong incentive to typically close out the contracts with this particular counterparty. And let's say the new trading should be stopped with them. No new agreements to enter into with this particular counterparty. Now, because of this, what is happening? This company which has defaulted against one, it will go into even more a bigger financial distress, because all others stopped interacting with this particular firm. Now this troubled firm is getting into more and more financial distress. But at least bringing in the netting, the institutions are less worried. In case their mark-to-market exposure is negative, so they will be concerned with the future potential exposure, and probably in that case they can very well go with demanding a collateral. But overall, what we could see is netting is reducing the concern when the counterparty is in distress. And because of that, the possibility of a systemic risk is getting reduced drastically. So that's the kind of positive impact netting can bring into the process. And just to sum up, we also want to look at the product coverage as a part of netting. See, every institution, it trades many financial products between each other, right? It could vary right from loans, repo transactions, interest rate related transactions, or it could be forex related transactions, commodities, or there could be equity related transactions, or there could be credit related transactions. You can think of, there could be different kinds of transactions between the two parties. So how well I am able to apply the netting to most or all of the products will play an important role in to how much extent the exposure is getting reduced. But in this process, there could be a few legal and other operational risks that are very much bound to crop up. Because if we typically look at bilateral netting, it's purely between two parties, and to a large extent it is very much recognized for OTC kind of derivatives or repo kind of transactions, or typically on balance sheet loans and deposits. Whereas if we talk about cross product netting, right, netting across the products, this is very much possible within any of these, like within this loans, within the repos, within each of these products, but it cannot be possible across the different product categories. Probably I can't have this, let's say this is called OTC derivatives. Within OTC derivatives, I can very comfortably do cross product netting, like between the interest rate hedge and forex hedge. I can very well do, but it may not be possible across the product categories, like I can't do between the OTC derivatives and repos, right? That is usually not possible. So going with the product coverage, if I look at the major financial products being the loans, the repo transactions and OTC derivatives, I can say the netting within each of these categories is quite possible, but across the categories becomes more and more difficult. So that is what we really need to be comfortable with the whole world of netting. And this is what I really wanted to cover as a part of this session on netting. Alright. Thanks a lot for listening to this session. Thank you very much. In this session, I'm going to talk about the termination features and the trade compression, which are targeted towards mitigating our counterparty credit risk. We have already talked about the netting, which is a very powerful tool which reduces the OTC derivatives exposure to a decent extent. That is the one which we have already talked about. But we also have to look at, are there any ways where I can reduce it even more further? And when we are talking about a typical ISDA agreement, they are generally bilateral, right? Which is they are between the counterparties. So can I think of some kind of multilateral netting instead of bilateral? What is the way we can work out with multilateral netting, and what is the kind of advantage that comes when there are three or more counterparties? Now that is the thing that is facilitated through this process called trade compression. And similarly, when I talk about the long dated derivatives, right, like interest rate swaps or currency, swaps which have a very long maturity period, the current exposure could be very, very small, but the potential future exposure could be very large and it could be a much unmanageable kind of stuff. So somewhere I need to have some kind of a feature that can reduce that high exposure in the future. Now this is where we talk about some kind of break clauses at any point in time when the exposure at a future point is much higher. I should be able to break the contract, or I should be able to do some kind of a resetting of the terms and conditions of the contract. So these are some more ways of addressing the counterparty risk. So as a part of this session, I want to primarily talk about the reset agreements, right? What do we mean by them and how do we really get in with them? Are there any kind of additional termination events where I can terminate? In what conditions I can terminate? Where we would be talking more and more regarding the break clauses, different kinds of break clauses that can be applied for minimizing your counterparty risk, and we will also talk about any kind of walkaway features that could exist in case the counterparty defaults. And towards the end, I will also spend some time in terms of talking about the trade compression, where we are majorly targeting a multilateral netting. So what is it all about? How do we do it? What is the significant advantage that comes with it? That is what we are going to deal in that particular session, in this particular session. Okay, let's get started. First, we will get started with the reset arrangement or reset agreement. So, the major objective of doing a reset is it is avoiding the trade to become strongly in the money, right? It is trying to prevent the trade from becoming strongly in the money, because it is readjusting the parameters which are specific to the project, right? It is readjusting the parameters, so which will make the trade to be more and more at the money. At any point in time, it is avoiding the trade to be strongly in the money. It is adjusting the parameters of the trade in such a way that the trade becomes more at the money. So things are getting reset. So generally what happens is the reset dates, the dates on which the parameters are reset, they are generally coinciding with the payment dates, the date on which the payments need to be made as a part of the long dated contract. Or in some cases, they could be purely based on the breaching or some value crossing or falling below. So on that time, the reset can very well be done. So the typical reset can be linked with the payments, or it could be linked with any breaching of a market value. Probably, I'll take an example of resettable cross currency swap, right? As a currency swap, let's say, which is resettable, I am looking at what generally happens in a typical cross currency swap. Whatever is the mark to market value of the swap, it is actually exchanged at the reset value, right? Whatever is the mark to market value on the reset date, it is exchanged between the two parties. And so because it is already exchanged, the forex rate, the new forex rate is reset to the current spot, because the mark to market value of the swap Instead of just computing it, we are really exchanging it with the other party. So the cash flow is already happening. The mark to market value of the swap, the cash flow is already happening, which means I can very well reset the exchange rate to the current spot rate. So which means the notional on one leg of the swap is going to change. So it's as good as I'm closing the existing transaction and I'm creating a kind of a replacement transaction. A new transaction is created with a new spot rate. So because of this, the exposure is completely coming down. So reset is nothing but I'm closing an existing transaction and creating a new transaction with the current rates and prices. So in a way, I'm breaking one single contract into multiple contracts of shorter time frames virtually. So that is what is the benefit that comes through a reset, and the exposure at any point in time is drastically reduced. That's one way where we can reduce the counterparty risk. Similarly, I can talk about additional termination events. Those kind of events or those kind of possibilities where I can terminate this agreement. So which we generally are calling them as the break clauses. How do I break the contract? So they give the possibility to terminate the trade before the credit worthiness actually goes down. Before the credit worthiness of the counterparty deteriorates, I am trying to make a mechanism where I can break the contract. Before it goes to the point of bankruptcy, I am trying to break the contract with my counterparty. So they are all considered, different mechanisms are considered as a part of the additional termination events. So we can talk about one or more dates on which I can take this action with respect to terminating, and with one or more counterparties. So whenever the break is exercised, let's say this is an option. So when I'm trying to exercise the break, so the party is simply terminating. So whenever we are putting out the break, the party is simply terminating the transactions at the current replacement value. Compute the current replacement value and terminate the contract at that particular price. So which means I have to really define what is the replacement cost. How do I compute the replacement cost? That makes the process more and more complicated. And am I considering the credit quality of here? See, replacement is now when I do the same transaction with some other counterparty, at what price I will enter into with that particular counterparty. So did I take into consideration the credit quality of the new counterparty with whom the same transaction is going to be executed if the current counterparty is defaulting? So I'm looking at the replacement cost, and at that replacement cost the contract is getting terminated. So but the challenge is, how do I really compute the replacement costs and whether the credit quality of the counterparty with whom I would be entering into the contract now is taken into consideration or not. So this mechanism is very useful when I am dealing with a good counterparty, and that too for a long-term maturity kind of a transaction. Very good if I am looking at a counterparty is good and a long maturity, because there is a good amount of time for the mark to market value of the transaction to become very much positive, significantly positive, and if it is a good counterparty going with that mean reversion kind of a mechanism, the credit quality of the counterparty can worsen over a longer period of time, which means averaging out could very comfortably work. And here, in terms of the breaking, the clause could very well be a bilateral, means between two parties. And this should be bilateral because any party can very well experience the same situation. And we can very well put the break clause, some kind of a lockout period, saying that the break clause is applicable only after probably 1 or 2 years or 3 years, and then there could be some pre-specified kind of dates. Rather than they being on a continuous basis, we can have a discrete set of dates on which the trade can be typically broken. So those are the things that could go as the different aspects. And many a times the termination of the transaction have to be clearly specified. Now, the events on which the termination occurs, they have to be very clearly specified. So, if we look at on a broader scale, the different kinds of termination categories, okay, there could be some kind of mandatory termination. So, the transaction will definitely terminate at the date of the break clause. The transaction is going to definitely terminate. Whereas on the other side, I can have an optional break clause, which means if it is a unilateral optional break clause, then the option is only for one party. But if it is a bilateral optional break clause, the option is provided for both the parties, where they have the option to terminate on that pre-specified dates. Here it's a mandatory termination on a pre-specified date. Here the parties have the option, if they really want to terminate, they can exercise that option. In some cases, we can have it like trigger based. So there will be some kind of a trigger, like a rating downgrade, or you can think of any other kind of a trigger. So when there is this, then probably we are talking about a trade being terminated. So the trigger should occur before the break clause is executed. So there could the break clause which the parties might have entered into could fall into any of these categories. But yes, this is much simpler, and it's just an extension of reset. Right, because we are at the reset, we are doing the payment process and we are continuing the new contract, whereas here we are not continuing the new contract, we are simply breaking the transaction. But when we look at the other two, the optional and the trigger based, so I need to play a very important role in defining the benefits very clearly. It's a big challenge. If you look at the optional, right, if I just try to understand with respect to optional, I really need to exercise it. Though I have the option, I have to take an initiative where I have to exercise it early before the credit quality of the counterparty declines, right? And the exposure is increasing substantially. Before these two happen, I have to take my call in terms of terminating. Because if I terminate it at the last minute, after all the damage is already done, then there is really no benefit at all. And it's unlikely to be useful because there is a systemic risk that has already occurred and the whole damage is already done. And at the same time, you see the other side. the clients, the counterparties with whom you have got into the transaction, they don't expect the break clauses to be exercised, because the relationship is something that could get spoiled. So even you may not be interested in exercising your relationships or exercising your optional triggers, optional break clauses, because you will not be interested in spoiling the relationship with your client. So very rarely the options are exercised, right? So in order to avoid, in order to maintain the relationship with the counterparty, we have seen so many examples in the past that the optional break clauses have not been exercised, right? And in many cases, we see that the bilateral break clauses, they appear more like gimmicks. They have not been utilized when they should be. So this is where actually the moral hazard comes into picture. I'm not utilizing them when they really need to be utilized. So the bank should have a very clear and consistent policy with respect to when to exercise the break clauses, and so that they can benefit and they can reduce the risk in a much better manner. And when it comes to the trigger based, especially when I'm using credit ratings, there are even more problems, because many a times when we are going with rating transition matrices and the probability of default computed based on the rating transition, I cannot get it from the market data. The probability of default and all, I cannot get it from the market data, which means I'm using the historical data, but it is very scarce and limited. And the biggest problem is the ratings, they come up after the whole damage has been done. We have seen even in the financial crisis, they are very extremely slow in reacting to the negative credit information. So after the whole damage has been done, the ratings will start downgrading. So even if you look at the Basel III, rating based triggers, the Basel III did not give any kind of benefit allocated to it, which is a very clear indicator that if I am using a rating based triggers for breaking the clauses, there is no significant benefit that I am going to get. There is no significant reduction in the risk that is going to happen. So before the crisis, the break clauses were typically required for the bank's trading with some non-collateral posting counterparties itself. But today, no such kind of distinctions do come up. So almost everyone is, almost in every case, the break clauses play an important role. So when it comes to the today's situation, the counterparties are demanding the break clauses which are linked to the bank's own credit rating, not the ratings that are coming by the external credit rating agencies. So that's what are the additional termination events that could be present. Then one more way of reducing the counterparty risk is having a walkaway feature. What is this walkaway feature? In some OTC derivatives, though today it's not a prevalent stuff, there used to be a feature called walkaway, which is more like tearing up of the contract. So this talks about cancelling. So this feature will allow the institution to cancel all the transactions in the event that the counterparty has defaulted. All the transactions with a particular counterparty will simply be cancelled out. So generally what we are seeing is when the mark to market value is negative, where the surviving counterparty has to pay the defaulted counterparty, that is when the walkaway feature will be exercised. So if they are in debt to the counterparty which has defaulted, this would be exercised. So logically speaking, this is not reducing my credit exposure at all. Right? I'm not getting any kind of a benefit. It's not reducing my credit exposure, but it is really allowing me to stop making payment to my defaulting counterparty. So I'm not obliged to settle the amount that I owe to my counterparty. So that is probably a benefit that I am getting, and I will get that benefit only if my mark to market value with the counterparty is negative. But that is creating a much more pressure on the counterparty which has defaulted. Because on one side, it is defaulted, its position has gone down, but at the same time, whatever you have to pay to that particular counterparty, that is going down even more worse because you are not paying what you are supposed to pay to it. It is worsening the situation of the counterparty even more. And that is where this has really created a blow on the counterparties which have defaulted. And that is the reason today, for a long period, they have not been used at all. They are not a part of the standardized ISDA documentation today. They do not mitigate the counterparty risk at all, but they do result in the potential gain where you are able to offset the risk of potential losses. Right? And any walkaway feature that is present, in case it is present, any walkaway feature, it's more and more unpleasant. Generally, it should be avoided because it is making the defaulted counterparty into a much more worse situation. The additional costs are coming up for the defaulted counterparty, so resulting in a very big moral hazard. Right? So that's the reason for majority of the ISDA agreements today, we don't see walkaway feature being implemented. But from the surviving counterparty's perspective, the benefit is it need not pay anything that it has to pay to the defaulted counterparty. That's the kind of a benefit that comes up. But again, that will impact the relationships with the counterparty again. Then, the next dimension that we are talking of is the trade compression that we can do, where the multilateral netting is the focus when there are multiple counterparties in the process. Because whenever we talk about a standard netting arrangement, it's purely bilateral. So between two institutions, it can reduce the credit exposure, which we have seen quite drastically, but it is purely between the two organizations. But let's say if A is trading with B, B is trading with C, and again A is trading with C, then probably each pair needs to have a kind of bilateral netting process. Rather than that, we can look at some kind of a mechanism where a trilateral netting occurs, A to B, B to C. Some such kind. There could be a centralized counterparty, whatever it is, but there could be a multilateral netting for 3 or more kind of institutions, which can simplify the netting process altogether. But it's not that easy because one, there are operational costs in coming up with this kind of mechanism. The biggest drawback comes how do I allocate the losses? Let's say in this process C has defaulted. How do I allocate the losses between A and B? Right? So that's a very challenging thing in multilateral netting process. How well do I allocate the losses if one of the counterparties are going to default? Which means there should be at least one organization which should act as a central counterparty which can take care of the entire multilateral netting. So generally there could be some central counterparty or some kind of an exchange which should play the role in terms of multilateral netting, where it can handle different aspects like the valuation of each of the transactions. It should take care of the settlement of each, and wherever the collaterals are required, it should really take care of the collateralization. But in this process, if we see, the biggest disadvantage that can come is there is a lot of mutualization and homogenization of the credit risk, counterparty risk. So there is typically the risk is homogenized. So which means probably earlier A used to monitor B and B used to monitor the risk associated and the credit quality of each of them. But today, because if there is a central counterparty, that incentive to monitor will go up because there is a central counterparty which is taking care of this. So why should I really be bothered about monitoring the credit quality of my counterparty exclusively? So that incentive is typically going up, and there is a mutualization and homogenization of the credit risk in the process. So the other way to do this kind of multilateral netting is what is through a trade compression. So what we are doing as a part of the trade compression is we are trying to reduce the redundancy due to the nature of trading. So we are trying to mention that the trades we are trying to compress in terms of the number as well as in terms of gross notional. The trade compression talks about combining the trades in terms of the number and the gross notional without changing the risk profile. And because of this, the operational costs are going down, and also the counterparty risk is actually coming down. So, but it all requires some kind of cooperation because we are trying to reduce the number as well as the gross notional between the counterparties. So it requires a lot of cooperation between the various participants. So every participant, they have to submit all their relevant trades which they want to compress. So they are matched based on the counterparty, right? Whatever the trades that are submitted, they are matched with respect to the counterparty to the trade, and they are cross-referenced against a trade reporting warehouse. And even the companies have to really specify what is the level of tolerance, making the whole compression process market risk neutral. The whole compression should happen in such a way that it is neutral to the market risk, as well as cash neutrality has to come out. So it's important not to breach the credit limit that is given to the counterparty here as well. So that's how the typical multilateral netting process can be addressed through the trade compression, where we are trying to compress the number of trades as well as the gross notional associated with the trades while keeping the risk profile intact. So these are the different mechanisms which could be treated as different termination features that could be associated with the contract, which could improve or which could reduce the counterparty risk even more further. Thanks a lot for listening to this session. Thank you very much.